Just about every one of us has a personal connection to addictions. Whether it's about ourselves or someone we know and love, it seems that we've all been touched by the grip of abuse, whether to substances or behaviors. And it can leave us feeling helpless and confused, either unable to deal with it or to help out in any positive way whatsoever. A walk down Main Street in just about any North American city these days will shockingly jolt us to the reality that addictions aren't just a private issue anymore. There are many more people that are publicly suffering from addictions than ever before. And such is the nature of addictions. They seem to grasp our loved ones and rip them away from us to somewhere else, a place that we can't access, or in many circumstances, even understand for our own well-being.
Until relatively recently, addictions were seen and categorized as the problem of weak people succumbing to the lure of dangerous drugs. But that ideology has undergone some major changes over the past few years. Rather than being viewed as a weakness, an inability to resist a certain substance or activity, addictions are increasingly perceived as a form of mental illness to which some of us are inherently more predisposed. So what is at the root of this mental illness then, if we can't blame everything on the drugs themselves? It appears that it may have a lot to do with the wirings of our brains, especially the effects of the quality of care that we received when we were younger in developing our sense of self and belonging. One fact that has emerged and become incontrovertible is that most addicts have experienced terribly difficult and traumatic lives, and that their addictions are, in some way, an attempt to alleviate the pain in which they live on a daily basis. As the eloquent and compassionate Dr. Gabor Mate puts it, addictions are always somehow rooted in pain. So instead of asking the question, why are they addicted, it may be more helpful to ask, why are they in pain? Of course, there are many circumstances where the addictions are rooted in attempts to overcome some kind of physical pain, like those people who are unable to get off pain medications after an injury from an accident, for example. However, it is vastly more common for addicts to be struggling to mask the difficulties and traumas that they have experienced throughout their lives, and suppress these deep-rooted sources of their own mental anguish. If we're to make any inroads into the problem of addictions and to try to help those in need, it seems obvious that we should look at the root of the problem, in the hopes of eliminating the need for the addictive behaviors in the first place. This is in stark contrast to the Western model of dealing with addictions, that is, one of arrest and punishment, under the assumption that the addicts are deviants who have willingly made the wrong personal choices in life, as opposed to the thinking that it may not be their own faults necessarily, and that they themselves are victims of circumstance that have led them down the wrong path in life. When we think of addictions, most of us typically think of drug abuse or alcoholism. But those are not the only kinds. In fact, we can become addicted to habits, foods, or activities too. Some people are addicted to sex, others to chocolate, some to high-risk behaviors, and many, many more to social media, for example. Since addictions are not restricted to drugs and alcohol, it may be helpful to note that the modern definition of having an addiction doesn't just refer to a person doing something that they shouldn't do but won't stop. Currently, addiction is characterized as being a neurological disease with compulsive cravings and use despite the harms that it causes. Those harms can be to one's own physical or mental well-being, to our loved ones around us, or to society as a whole. So what causes this compulsive craving and use in the first place? Many argue that drugs and alcohol, for example, are just straight-up addictive substances, and if you take too much, you'll inevitably get hooked. And that is their simplistic explanation of why addicts are not capable of shaking their habits. So let's have a look to see if taking hard drugs or alcohol inevitably leads to addictions. A recent survey asked Canadians about their use of crystal meth, and found that around 4.5% of respondents said that they'd tried it at some point in their lives. But in a follow-up question about whether they'd used crystal meth in the past year, only half of 1% said that they had taken the drug in the previous 12 months. If crystal meth was so addictive and you couldn't shake the habit, then the number of people who have ever tried it and the number of people still taking it recently would be a lot more similar. Except most meth users have actually stopped using it. That doesn't sound like the substance is incontrovertibly addictive in and of itself.
Another study, published in the Canadian Journal of Medicine, looked at over 6,000 hospital patients who were being treated for chronic pain and taking morphine, a powerful opiate related to heroin, fentanyl, and OxyContin. There was no evidence to suggest that once they completed their treatment and left the hospital, that these people continued to be hooked on opiates. For the most part, they just went about their regular lives without the need to take any more of the drugs. So the evidence is not really strong at all to suggest that taking hard narcotics will inevitably lead to drug addictions. So then, what is actually going on when people really do get addicted to these substances?
Most of the original research that shows links between drug use and addictions has come from lab rat studies, where individual rats are isolated in cages and given access to drugs like heroin or cocaine. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, these lonely rats quickly settled into regular habits of taking the drugs, thus supporting the idea that the drugs themselves are the root of the addictions. However, that changed in the 1980s when a Canadian university professor, Dr. Bruce Alexander, noticed a flaw in the experimental design of those rat drug trials. The flaw being that rats, like most mammals, are actually social beings. Therefore, social isolation is not a good baseline to use when testing for the potential of developing drug addictions. So, Dr. Alexander set up a drug study using lab rats that were not caged alone without social contact. For his experiment, he created what became known as Rat Park, a large living space that housed many rats of both sexes and contained lots of areas to allow for play, sleep, sex, feeding, and all other activities that healthy and social rats could enjoy. They were also given droppers that contained morphine that they could consume at will. Interestingly, in Rat Park, none of the rats got hooked on morphine. Most would learn to avoid it entirely after a while. The researchers even tried to entice the rats to take the morphine by lacing those droppers with sugar water, but they still didn't want it. They also bred a cohort of rats to become addicted to morphine and then put them in Rat Park. Well, even these drug-addicted rats stopped taking the drug once they acclimatized to the happy vibe of the park. This study clearly shows that it was not likely that the pull of the drug was the cause of addiction in the early social isolation studies, but rather that the drug was providing the rats with a substitute for something crucial that was missing in their lives at the time: freedom, happiness, and comforting social interactions. What is the biochemical link in the brain between stress and loneliness and having a propensity for taking opiates like morphine, heroin, or fentanyl? It turns out that these drugs act on our body's own endogenous opioid system, one that is run by endorphins. Endorphins are neurochemicals that govern our attachment system, the one that creates deep emotional bonds between people, as much for the bond between parents and their babies as for our relationships with friends, family, and lovers later in life. Endorphins not only make us feel connected to others and provide a sense of well-being, but they're also our body's natural painkillers, alleviating physical pain and mental anguish. So the endorphin opiate system is one that is built when we are babies and leads to our feeling like a socially connected and comfortable human in life. Like the lab rats that were caged in isolated conditions, people who lack meaningful social contacts and loving bonds with others will suffer a deficit in their endorphin-based attachment system. Consequently, they will crave anything that can compensate for the feelings of despair and loneliness that they're experiencing. Taking drugs like heroin or OxyContin can offer temporary relief. Alcohol and cannabis use are also known to have soothing effects on the opioid attachment system in our brains. The negative effects are even more profound when the attachment system fails to develop properly at an early age. Babies that do not experience love and tenderness in their first years of life will not be able to properly develop aspects of their limbic system and prefrontal cortex that they would otherwise rely upon to make them feel whole. In fact, the worse the treatment that babies get, the more likely they are to become drug addicts when they're adults. Trauma that develops following episodes of infant abuse, either physical, emotional, or sexual, impairs the normal growth and development of the young child's limbic system and its ability to regulate emotions. This leads to having a brain that lacks the proper neurochemistry to handle life's ups and downs, and which is chronically short of feel-good chemicals like endorphins. Trauma-inducing events in one's life dramatically increase the odds of addictions, especially if that trauma occurs early in life. However, the opioid attachment apparatus is not the only brain function that is impaired by adverse childhood or lifetime experiences. The incentive motivation apparatus of the limbic system is governed by dopamine. In this emotional system, dopamine rewards the brain and body with good feelings to promote important human activities like exploration, seeking pleasure, and learning new behaviors. Typical activities like eating good food and having sex would normally increase dopamine levels in our brains in such a way as to encourage us to continue seeking out these types of behaviors. However, adverse life experiences, particularly in the early years of life, also act to stunt this dopaminergic apparatus for seeking incentives and rewards. Individuals who suffer from underdeveloped regions in this part of their brain are highly susceptible to craving substances that act upon the dopamine receptors in the brain, such as cocaine or crystal meth. Once the neurochemistry of addictions and their effects on the socio-emotional systems in our brains are considered, it becomes clear that addicts are not people who've simply made poor life choices. Rather, they're mostly humans that have lived their lives enduring incredible amounts of pain and suffering that their brains are not equipped to deal with, and so do not have the ability to properly manage their negative emotions. Addicts are typically people who have suffered traumatic abuse or other adverse life experiences and who lack the internal chemically based happiness system that most of us take for granted each and every day.
In light of this knowledge, it seems a little bit inhumane to punish addicts by taking away the drugs and throwing them in jail, as has been the traditional response by society up until relatively recently. Also, we're learning more and more about the neuroplasticity of our brains, meaning how capable they are of change. This brings some hope to the people who are suffering from mental anguish and who are driven to taking drugs as a result. The answer to helping addicts shake their addictions lies not in removing the drugs, but rather removing the need for the drugs. As we shall see in the next episode, therapies exist that can help addicts rid themselves of the haunting effects of mental traumas, allowing their brains to build new and healthy emotions to truly heal themselves.